Hello, and welcome back to our series on learning Google Apps scripts for HR, brought to you by Prairie-HR-Solutions, where we believe knowledge should be shared and in empowering our fellow HR professionals in truly thinking how we deliver our HR services and solutions by using tools we probably already have at our disposal. My name is Jake Finger, Principal Consultant here at Prairie-HR-Solutions, and in this video, I'd like to continue on with our user interface project. We left off by pushing data in the form of a user inputted data. And what we did was we took that data and sent it over to our spreadsheet to create a new row. So right now we have the employee number. So we could just type a number in there, hit record, and it'll go through and add a new record here along with the date that it was entered. If you remember, when we added all these fields in last time, our UI became somewhat cluttered and honestly pretty ugly. And what we're wanting to do this video is kind of clean this up a little bit and make it looking a little bit better and more user friendly. So when we talk about styling and changing the appearance within HTML, what we're talking about is called Cascading Style Sheets, or CSS is the abbreviation. And a good way to think about the three, HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, on the client side anyway, is that the structure and the framework itself falls under HTML. The functionality is within the script, the JavaScript, PHP, or whatever. And the appearance is within CSS. So let's clean up this user interface here. Now, I don't want to get too deep into CSS. Again, though, if you would like me to do a separate video series on that, I definitely can. Just let me know. The way CSS works at a high level, let's get back over to our code here, and this is our HTML. The way CSS works is you identify a selector, and a selector can be in the form of many things. You have a tag selector, which our tag selector is like, say, this input, this H2. This is a tag, and we're selecting that whole tag. We can also do it by ID. And let's grab this ID here. So essentially, we would select this ID, and anything with this ID would be styled the same exact way, however it is that we determine that. And it's the same with the tag. If we select this input tag, then everything with that same tag would be styled the same exact way. And then you can also do by what's called class. So what we could do is, instead of like this input type number, we could assign this a class, and then we would just name that class, whatever, like input field or whatever we wanted it to be. And then we could select that class, style it, and then anytime an element has that class assigned to it, it would be styled the same exact way. And of course, there are other selectors, such as pseudo selectors and attributes when we're dealing with media or pictures, but we won't get into that. We'll just keep it relatively high level here. So styling within an HTML file can actually become a feat in its own. And you would either have to, say, copy or paste or create a brand new CSS file for each HTML file. So you would have to redo the CSS, the styling for every single HTML, or you could just create a library and then copy and paste that library anytime you do a new HTML page or whatnot. So luckily, though, there are CSS libraries available for free that can actually save us quite a bit of time. And we will get into those because we'll use that for this UI. But first I want to show you the basics of CSS just to give you a high level view of what's actually occurring. And then we'll jump in and grab a library. So going back to our sheet here, unfortunately, Google removed the ability to change the size of this sidebar here. So it's set permanently at 300 pixels, I believe. That looks about right. Ideally, it would be great if we could take this UI and extend it out to about maybe right here. But if we do get so complex and there's so much stuff happening here in this UI that we do need more room, it may be better just to remove it from a sidebar and just create our own little web app page, which we may actually do in the future, depending on how large this truly becomes. But one thing we can do is change everything that we put inside this sidebar. And this here, everything that I just highlighted is actually the HTML that we created. We created this welcome and all these fields here. So we can change this. And if you look at what's actually occurring, it seems like this is just one big line. And it's breaking here at the end and then creating a new line, but it's not breaking evenly. So what I'm thinking is a quick way to sort of separate this out is by just going in and changing how far these fields go over. So instead of having it go over 100% of the way, let's try and just have it go over 50. And what that'll do is it'll break, it should break a little bit cleaner. So what we'll do is we will go back over here to our HTML file. To create CSS or a stylized section within our HTML, we need to create style tags. And the style tags, we want those style tags to render or be read and then populated before the page loads. We don't want it to look like it did before, all gross and ugly, and then change itself, because that's just going to confuse the user. So we want it to render before the page loads, before this body section right here loads in. So we place our style tags in our head section. So as you can see, this is our head section, and our head section runs before our body. So let's create our style tags. And anytime you create a tag, you typically need a end or a closing tag. And all of our CSS will go right in here. This is all CSS. As you can notice that when you're typing, it changes a different color because it's saying that CSS should go here. So what we want to do is we want to grab this body. Now this body, if you look down here, this body takes everything. It is all this. To include our script. But what we want to do is we want to take this body and shrink it down to 50% of what it is that we are looking at in our UI. So since this body is a tag, we can just simply select it by hitting body. And then what we want to do is do curly brackets. This is the syntax for CSS. And inside this set of curly brackets here is what we want our CSS to do with that tag, with this body tag. And what we want to do is we want to do, let's just simply do width. We want to change the width. We do a colon, and then it's whatever we want the width to be. So our sense, I believe we decided that we wanted it to be 50%. And then we end that with a semicolon. Now what should happen is our CSS will grab this body tag and change it to where it will only be 50% wide of the entire UI. So let's go ahead and change that, save it. We'll go back to our sheet here. You can see how gross it looks. And now let's refresh it and see what happens. Okay, perfect. Now, as you can see, I know it's a little cut off right here, but condensing it down to 50% actually made it a lot more user-friendly. So now let's actually look at the spacing in between the employee number field and then the last name. Let's create a little bit more of a space and then maybe also move the left-hand margin over just a bit. Let's go back to our HTML file here. Now, since we want to move our body or the body of the UI over, what we can simply do is set a margin, because the margin is left and right. Now you can actually drill down and do margin left, margin right, margin top, margin bottom. If we do margin, it's going to do all four of them. Then we do a colon. And instead of doing a percentage, we want to give it a specific amount to move. So we can do this either by the pixels, which can get kind of strange and funky when people go to different, like say a laptop to a phone to a tablet. It can get kind of weird because pixels are different, are read differently. Or we can do what's called EMs. So let's try an EM and let's move it over to EM. Again, if you want me to get more in depth into CSS and all these terminologies, I will. But for right now, we'll just keep it very high level. So let's set the margin at 2 EM. We'll save it. Go back to our sheet. And then let's refresh it and see what happens. Okay, there we go. We moved it over. We created a little bit of space. Now remember, when we moved over the margin, this is the margin up top here. This is the margin. This is the margin. And then below here is the margin. What we didn't set is each individual field. What we did was we set the entire body margin. So what we need to do is go in here and set every single margin of these fields. So to do that, what we need to do is select all of these. And if you'll look, you'll realize that our fields themselves are in this input tag. So we could select simply the input tag, and then every time an input tag occurs, it will adjust that margin. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll create a new selector. We'll do input, curly brackets, and then this time we want to do margin hyphen bottom, because we just want some space at the bottom there. And then let's try 3 EM initially, and we will save it. Now let's go back and see how that looks. Oof, that's too far. But you'll see that it's separated at the bottom of every single one of our inputs 3 EMs. So 3 EM, 3 EM. So that looks a little too much. So let's actually go back and change this 3 to maybe 1. We'll save it. Now let's go back and see how that looked. We'll go back up here, refresh it. Okay, that looks good. I can live with that. One thing to think about when we're dealing with code, the best way, at least from my perspective, and this is how I learned code and I continue to learn code, is I take a snippet of code, especially when it comes to CSS, And then I do what we just did. I change something, and then I figure out what actually changed in the page. And then I can see that, okay, the margin bottom is changes the bottom part of the margin. Now, what we could do to illustrate this, let's go margin left, if I can spell it right, and then let's set that at 3M and then see what actually changes. So you can learn by changing code that we already have or that you've copied from somewhere else or was provided to you, and then see what changes. And that is a great way to learn what is actually happening with the code. So now when we go up in here and refresh it, see that it took the input and it moved it over. So if we wanted to do indentation, that's a great way to do indentation. But keep that in mind when you're dealing with code. A lot of times you'll find that people do things a lot differently. There are millions and one way to do things within code to get you to the same result. And if you come across those, you can use the code snippet if it's free and usable and change something to really understand what the code is doing and how it's working. Okay, but for right now, we don't want to do anything with the margin left. We'll just go back and leave the margin bottom and then save it. So we could keep going and just create essentially classes for all of our elements and then stylize each class until we got to where we wanted. But that can become quite cumbersome because then we got to start thinking about how we want the input fields to interact, certain colors, the border colors, the border weights, if we want curved borders and whatnot. So it can get pretty complex. But fortunately, there are individual organizations that have actually created a library for us. And if you can find one of those organizations that style their HTML samples as something that you would like, then you can use them if they're free. And a lot of them are free. And what I personally like to use is what's called Bootstrap. And it's a front end toolkit that built out a lot of HTML functionality and structure along with the CSS. And all you have to do is call inside our head section Bootstrap to get use of that CSS file. Now, I'm not advocating for them in any way. It's just something that I currently use. And I currently use them because they update their files regularly. And to get to Bootstrap, you just go to www.getbootstrap. Let me go over here and I have it open. So as you can see, this is Bootstrap. And what Bootstrap is it is a front end toolkit and it has pre-built CSS components as well as JavaScript plugins. So certain things like I'm sure you've seen accordions and inside HTML web pages that you can collapse and open. Those take uses of JavaScript plugins because it's a functionality. It's not just a static input field, but it does something. And that's where these script plugins come in. So what we want to do is we want to go up here to our docs. And when we go to the docs section here, we will be provided with a quick start template. So it's asking you to create an index.html file, which we already did. So let's go back here and our HTML file is not indexed. You'll come across a lot of instances to where the HTML page is called the index, but what we did was we called it hrsidebar.html. So we've already done that. We have it. And this is the template that we could start with. Now, we already started with our HTML, so we don't need this whole thing. What we do need is this head portion and everything above it. So we can simply just copy that, and then we can go back to our code. And if you notice, we copied the whole head section, but we don't want to remove what we already created. So what we can do is just create a space here, and then paste that in, and then kind of work our way backwards. So we know that we already have this head along with our HTML tag and our beginning doc type tag. So we don't need that. And then we also have this closing tag, which we don't need because we already have it down here. And then we also don't need our body and our input. Well, I'll leave this in here for now, because what's happening when we call here in a second our Bootstrap is it will contain our style. You'll notice that it has title here. So we don't want our title to be Bootstrap Demo. So we can change that, and we'll just change it to HR interface for now. And when you see this these meta tags, this meta name viewport content with device, these tags here are important when we're dealing with websites that will be used on a laptop, on a desktop, on a tablet, or a cell phone. This handles how that HTML is actually produced there, because if you go from a web page that's very wide to a cell phone, you don't scroll to the left and the right to see the page. It adjusts it to where it will fit on that viewport. So that's what this is. So now let's go back to our Bootstrap, because we're not done grabbing things yet. So now what we need to do is include Bootstrap CSS and JavaScript plugins. So you'll see that after this title, it's wanting us to pull this Bootstrap CSS file. So essentially what this link is doing, it's connecting our HTML to their CSS file. Now, what you could do is you could go down, you could scroll all the way down and actually download the entire Bootstrap file. Like you can go to this version 5.33 and download the whole thing. And then it comes in a zip file. You can unzip it, and then you can just have the CSS file there and pull it all over. But that takes up quite a bit of space. I just find it easier to call it from our head HTML piece and then incorporate it that way. So let's grab this. Let's grab this link. We'll copy that, and then we'll go back in here, and remember, it is right after our title, before our closing. We're going to put it right before our style that we created. So we'll insert it right there. And then we have the JavaScript piece, because certain components within their HTML file, in order for it to get it to look and function the way that they have it, is we need to use their JavaScript file. And if you look, it is embedded within their body, right below the body tag, where since we already have script completed in ours, what we will do is we will put it above our script tag, because we want it to run before our script runs. Because their script is not actually doing anything with the data. It's just working on the functionality of the independent components. And we want that stuff to run before our stuff. So we put it right there. Now what we can do is save it. And then we can go back to our page here. And if you remember how it looked, keep how it looks in your mind because it's going to change. It should change if we copied everything over correctly. Okay, now you see it changed. The boxes are a little bit cleaner. The font changed a little bit. And you'll notice that our record button has this little border here. And we can go in and type in, let's say 16, hit record. Our functionality should not have changed, and it did not. So now what we can do is go in and grab their components and begin using their components to change our fields and fonts to look a little bit cleaner. So let's go back to our Bootstrap page here. And let's change the very first one that we have, and that is that employee number. And that employee number is an input box. So what we can do is scroll down here to content. You'll see that they have a section for layout, for content. Now their content is the typography, the font sizes, image, tables. What we're looking for is form, because that's kind of what we're creating. And we are looking for input group. So here are the examples of Bootstrap's input groups. And you'll see that they use what's called spans here, which is kind of cool. We have text boxes, and all we're really looking for is just a typical input box. And I'm thinking that we really don't need anything. We don't need this span because we don't need to say anything with, like with text area. We don't need that because if we do that, then it's going to squish over. It's going to squish over our view. Let's go in and let's see what else they have here. Yeah, what we'll do is we can use this. What we can do is just grab this default here. And that default is this. You can see how it's default. And this span here is where that default is. So let's grab this. And you'll notice, if you remember right, previously I mentioned that we weren't going to use the abbreviation div for division. And the reason for that is because div is a term that's used to clump sections of HTML code together. So if you wrap anything in a div, it belongs to that grouping. So what we do is we just highlight all that. And then what we can do is go back into our code here and we can create, we can start working on changing this. So let's go ahead and create a space in between this employee number field and label group and just paste in our group right here. So what we can do is let's save it and see what just happened. So what we did was we created a space in between our employee number field. So we created a space right here in between our employee number field and our last name. And then what's going to happen is we implanted this div component in the form of an input type in between that. So let's go back and see what that did. So what we'll see is a space and then Bootstrap's version of their input along with their CSS. So let's refresh this. Now, as you can see, it created this default and box. And the reason it created this default and this box is squished is because we are only giving it 50% of the view. So if we were to go back up and say, let's just get rid of this body here, because CSS within, or the Bootstrap CSS already contains a body tag. So we can actually just get rid of this whole style thing here. Let's just get rid of it. And then see what I did is I went back through here and I got rid of our entire style. And we're just going to rely specifically on Bootstrap style in their CSS file. So now if we open up our sidebar, what will happen is you'll see that, yes, it went back to being ugly for what we created. But if you notice, we are now using CSS and Bootstrap. So we can start replacing our fields and labels with that. Let's try, and instead of using default, let's try and keep this span and see how it looks. Because I was looking at first name and maybe the first name would have pushed it over a little bit, but let's try it and see if we like it or not. So now we can go back down here to our HTML file and let's replace our employee tag, our employee number, with their component here. So our ID is not going to be input group sizing default. It's going to be our ID up here. And instead of this default, what we want it to read is imp num, just like we have here. And what we may do is instead of using a label, we might just use the span. Now this class, if you can see this class right here, they are designating this span for this input as this class. So we don't want to change that because they're using this for their CSS. The same with this class right here and this class for this div. So what we can also change is, well, actually, let's just leave it for this right now. Just for right now, let's just get rid of our piece here. And now this area described by and area label, now it's saying sizing example input and input group sizing default. We'll leave this alone for right now because we're not going to change any of that. We'll save it. Now what we should do is, you'll notice that this span class, we have the span as the ID and the imp number as the display text. Now, I'll go back here and I'll show you a pitfall that can be run into quite a bit. Just keep in mind that our ID is on our span. Okay, that looks nice. I like that. Now our ID is here. So if we go in and say we type a 78 and then hit record, it's not going to populate anything in this field, the employee number, because our ID is not on the employee number text field, it's on the span. So if we go back here, and instead of having the ID be on the span, what we can do is cut that out and then put it in our input tag where it belongs. And this isn't going to be text, it's going to be a number. So now what we can do is save that and then go back to our sheet here and then hit user interface, open our sidebar. Now we moved this ID from the span over to our text, and notice how this is no longer just regular text. It is now a number. So let's go ahead and put another number in here. Let's go 17. And then we hit record. And then you'll notice Now it works because it's pulling the ID from the correct place. Now, say we wanted to change this title through JavaScript, then we would put an ID in here to select this span. But for now, we're not doing that. So now what we can do is go back here and actually create the rest of these. And let's do that real quick. So what we can do is we can copy this whole section. And instead of employee number, it is the last name. And instead of it being a number, this is a text. It's best to go straight line by line. Our ID for our last name is last name. And then this is camel case. Got to be careful about that. And then what we can do is go down, and since this is text, I'm going to recopy this. We don't need our last name here anymore. And this is going to be now first name. This is going to be first name. We won't need first name anymore. And then we'll create another one for our division here. For our division. And that is text. And this one we did lowercase division. We can get rid of that. And then our next one we have is our job title. And if you're not following along, or if I'm moving too fast, I do apologize, but this whole code will be inside our source code document for this episode. So then you can just copy it and paste it into your file there. Okay, so we have that. And then now this salary here, instead of having this span show salary, what we can do is simply put a $sign. And then the ID is salary. And what that will show is the $sign in front of whatever that salary is. Now this button piece right here is a little bit, if you remember right, this is what our button looked like. It's just a typical, 1990s style looking button. Let's go over and look at Bootstrap buttons and see what they got. So now what we want to do is go down here in components and we'll see buttons. Okay, so let's see. We see that it's a button type button class. So let's go ahead and copy this. And then what we'll do is we'll go back over to our HTML page. And we'll put this button below it. And then let's save it and see the difference and see which one we like better. I'm pretty sure, unless we're looking for nostalgia, I'm sure we'll like the other Bootstrap version better. Okay, so this is just a typical button. Let's see what else we can do with this button. Okay, so you can see that it's base class. Let's see the variants of the buttons that we can use here. Okay, so we can color it. It changes a little bit of color when it's focused. Let's see what happens when it clicks. Not much. That works. We can color the button a little bit. We could also do links. We don't want to do links. We have outline buttons, which change color on focus. Do like that. So let's see what's different. Secondary. Okay, so that is this button right here. And it seems that the difference here is that button outline secondary. And as you can see, this is a class. So when it does, like if you think about CSS, remember how we called that class, and a class you call by adding a period in front of it. So in their CSS, they're calling this button outline secondary class, and then that's how they're getting the color and the focus change. So it's nice that they did all the work for us, and we are using with pride. I apologize, I'm sharing the incorrect one. So let me share this Bootstrap page here. And what I did was I went down here to this outline buttons. And what we're going to use is this secondary button right here. So we're using this one right here. So we just select that. And then we copy it. And now let's go back over to our scripts and get rid of this button and replace it with our secondary. And then we can hit or change this secondary to record. And this ID, if you remember right, we select this, we added an event listener down here by getting the element by ID. So we're going to need to give our new button an ID. And we can simply do that by grabbing this and pasting it down. And then we can just remove this button. So now let's save it and go back to our page and see how that actually occurred. I'll refresh our page. Okay, so we have our tabs. We have this. I like it. And then our record button is just their secondary button. Okay, I like it. So let's check to make sure everything worked. We hit record. Shouldn't have changed the functionality. It just changed the look. And there we go. One thing that I want to do is let's see if we can change the color of this span here. We'll do that a little bit later on. Let's go ahead and end our video here. And the next video, what I'd like to do is possibly change the color of the spans just to where it's not, white. Give it a little bit more separation between that. And then we will work on our functionality to pull the rest of our fields, like the rest of our fields here, into their appropriate column. And then we can really start building out our UI. So again, if you really enjoy what we're doing, please hit that subscribe button and we can continue to bring you content. Until next time, please take care.